crafty friends, it's Jess from jesscrafts.com, and today I'm here with a card and video for Create a Smile stamps. Today my inspiration was using the Superpowers stamp set, which includes this superhero mouse that will be on my final card. I wanted to use this because I thought it was well suited to the types of cards I like to make, namely encouragement cards. And so I decided to pair it with the Stars Polka stencil. When deciding how I would add color through the stencil, I thought about a few different mediums and remembered how simple, easy, and it is to use the distress stain, and it's actually really fast to clean up too. So I'm just tapping my squeezed lemonade distress stain through the stencil. It's pretty important to have a light touch because if you press too hard, you will put too much ink on and it will bleed underneath the stencil. What I will say about using distress stain is you're not going to get as crisp of images as you would with using, say, distress inks, but the cleanup is so quick. You just kind of dab a cloth over it and it's clean enough to move on to the next color. Whereas if you were to use traditional distress ink or other inking through the stencil, you will have to go wash the stencil, dry it, etc., etc. So this was just kind of a fast alternative for me. And this ink, I believe, is Salty Ocean. So this time I wanted to see how I felt about swiping as opposed to dabbing, because I thought, well, you would be able to see the texture of the swipes. And I think that this is an idea that I will play with again in the future, but didn't quite work out for the stars. But if you do the swiping, you'll actually see those swipe lines. But I found that, like, if you would miss a corner of a star, it might not be so obvious that it was meant to be a star. So I wasn't sure that's really what I was going for. But, just an idea to throw out there. You can give it a try. It's, of course, just paper, so I probably should have just went with it. And but anyway, I did decide in the end, after I dabbed it on and got a good amount of color, that I would swipe, just so that it gave it a little bit of a different pattern, if you will. It's a very subtle thing, but just, an idea. Next up, I wanted to show you coloring the mice. They are relatively easy to color and you don't need a lot of colors for them. I decided to go with a primary colors theme for my card, so I'll be using the yellow stars, blue stars, and then I'm going to pull in red through the cape. I'm using R17, R29, and R27. A lot of times people first suggest coloring based off of how close the colors are, so like maybe combining an R14 and an R17, but I have found that that's not something that you need to hold yourself to at all. And one good resource for finding out different combinations and blends would be Sandy Allnock's hex chart. But I also recommend, I like to take Copic classes, even though I feel like I color pretty well. I enjoy my Copic coloring. I always want to learn more, and sometimes I decide not to do intense coloring, but I have taken classes with Sandy Allnock. I have taken classes through it's Jennifer McGuire and Christina Warner's card making site. I wish I could, cardclasses.com, I think it is. Yeah. And Kitten Clouder. So those are just some that I recommend and felt like I learned from. But anyway, to color this mouse, I'm just doing some very simple shading. I want the darkest areas to be where the cape is meeting his body. His ear will cast a shadow. His cape will also cast a shadow onto his body. So that's another place I'm going to add a shadow. I also will add the shadows at the top and bottom of his face to give him some dimension. It will make his face appear rounded. I could also suggest if you're interested to add a bit of texture, because the mouse would of course actually be furry. So you could add in like little flicks at the end meant to be fur. But I personally prefer to color my mice without fur. I kind of mice have pretty short hair, so I don't usually like the look of like a super fuzzy mouse. And then I'm going to come in with some R00 and R000 in order to make his ear. And his ear is just sort of going to fade out into the gray. I am not going to continue that line, but there's just a touch of pink. Once I had all the markers out and picked some colors, I felt like I may as well color a few mice. It's kind of the same thing. When I'm stamping the stamp, I may as well stamp a few extra. So I'm going to talk about what I do with that kind of thing. I cut out a piece of the blue stenciled paper with the stacking pierced banners from Create a Smile, and then I am going to use the All About You stamp set from Create a Smile to create the sentiment. You certainly could use one of the sentiments from the Superpowers stamp set that the mouse came from, but I will say that Create a Smile makes some of my favorite sentiment sets. They have this you one and a hello one where they have a couple different fonts of you and then all kinds of things to add to it, or a couple different fonts of hello and all things to add to it. And there might even be like another, I think there's one like friend with different things to add to it. So I find myself using their sentiment sets a lot. I did get a little bit of like yellow or something where I didn't want it, and I was able to use my Tombow sand eraser to pick that up. In this case, I worked on watercolor paper for the Distress stain, just because it is a kind of water-based medium. But I used 110-pound Recollections cardstock to do my Copic coloring. It's what I do most of my Copic coloring on. I have started trying out Nina, but I like both so far. I'm going to emboss my sentiment just because it is stamped on top of that star, and embossing it makes it just a touch more readable. It makes it a darker black and gives that little bit of dimension. So that's a tip for if you're ever trying to stamp on pattern paper. Embossing your sentiment can make it give that little extra pop that makes it readable even when it's stamped on pattern paper. I am going to pop up my critter because it is a relatively simple card in the end. And if I were going to make this card again, I think that I would put a black mat underneath this blue banner as well. I just felt like since the blue and the yellow pattern were so similar, they could have used something to break them up. And again, I put the yellow on top of a black mat. So putting both layers on top of the black mat would probably have, grounded the card more or something like that. Just again, a thought, because I don't always do everything exactly the way I wish I would have. And then that was it for my main card that I intended to make, but I had all of these superhero mice colored up because, like I said, when you color one, it's so simple to color more. So I went to an old 6x6 paper pad. This is a Lawn Fawn paper pad that I'm pretty sure you can't even buy anymore if you wanted to. And as you can see, I have a lot of scraps in the bag. I keep my 6x6 paper pads in quart size zip top bags. I keep a lot of things in my craft room in zip top bags actually. And that way I'm able to keep all of the scraps together with the paper. In this particular instance, instead of just scraps, I actually had die cut these two star backgrounds with some cat scrappiness stitched scalloped dies. So when I went to make use of these particular scraps, I decided to use those because it made for a simple card. And generally, I am leaning towards a masculine card, but of course, these would be well suited to anyone of any age. But, I donate a lot of my cards. I say that all the time. And I say it not to brag about donating cards. I say it because a lot of people will say, oh, I never knew you could donate your cards. And that's something that brings joy to their card making. So I wanted to let as many people know as possible that that is something that you can do and enjoy in your card making. I am using an embossing powder bag to make sure that the embossing powder only sticks on top of where I have placed it. So I'm going to always use that when I'm doing embossing, and I'm using VersaFine ink and then clear embossing powder as opposed to black embossing powder. I basically made these two cards the same. I just found two small scraps that I could cut banners out of. They both happened to be blue, which coordinated perfectly, and then I was able to be done with those cards. I also found a scrap where I had cut out a stitch circle and then didn't use it on a project. And the point of showing you this is just to kind of show you what you can do with scraps, how you can make a card come together. I did have full-size pieces left in this paper pack, but I said to myself, like, I'm not going to use them. My challenge, what I'm challenging myself to do, is to really just make use of some of these scraps. So I embossed the sentiment again. I'm going to just make that sort of the focal point. I have these strips of pattern paper that are all about the same size and width. So I decided to line up 3 of them, and 2 of them happen to be the same pattern, but I think you really, like, you'd use 3 different patterns. And what's nice is they're all going to coordinate and match. You don't really have to think about the colors. And I can just place that circle on top of it in the center. Again, popped up the mouse, I think, on all of these cards, just for that little bit of extra dimension. And I wound up being able to use up scraps and make 3 more really quick cards with the leftover images. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. If you are interested in more crafting tutorials, be sure to subscribe to my channel. I will leave you links to the products used in the video description below, as well as to Create a Smile. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.